let me officially welcome you to this morning's webinar. It is Emma here from Future of Leadership. Thank you so much for joining us for our June webinar featuring Jimmy Burrows. Today's topic is applying situational leadership models in the new normal, which I'm really excited to hear about. So before we get started, let me just tell you a little bit about Jimmy. Jimmy is one of New Zealand's most gifted leadership futurists, having transitioned from military officer to corporate GM and then to fully remote business owner. He truly grasps the challenges a modern leader faces and knows how to thrive in new, unfamiliar environments. Jimmy's approach was built and tested working in a variety of remote environments, from the Caribbean to the deserts of Afghanistan and Iraq. He takes a pragmatic, supportive lens to mentoring leaders to adapt and succeed, acting as a sounding board and often offering practical tips instead of working from theory and trying to retrofit academic models to make sense. Outside of work, Jimmy is a keen scuba diver, runner, and has been to nearly 70 countries on his mission to find the perfect spot to build a beach house. Having chatted to Jimmy in the lead up to this webinar, I am really excited to listen for the next 45 minutes. So I'm going to hand over to Jimmy in one sec, but before I do, during this session, if you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A or the chat box. And at the end of this session, I will jump back on and Jimmy will answer those for you. But for now, Jimmy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to switch screens, so hopefully everybody can see a slide pack. And if you can, then you can just drop a comment, yes, or see it, or something like that, just so we know. Emma, I think you're going to be manning the chat, is that, or personing the chat, should I say?
Correct.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Fantastic. Well, hey, welcome everybody. Today is going to be 45 minutes of hopefully fascinating information, learning some new stuff, reinforcing some stuff you already knew. And what I aim to do is try and make it so it seems really easy and obvious to understand. And that's my kind of pragmatic approach. If you have any questions, as Emma said, pop them in the chat. And if you drop off at any point during the call, then please do jump back in using the same link that you had previously. Feel free to take notes. I have my Apple Pencil ready to go, and if you've got a notepad or a notebook, then use that. It's good to jot down ideas, insights, and light bulb moments as they come to you. And my intent today really is to share with you a little bit about the basis of some of the leadership models I use, the power of reflection, and how that applies in the modern day. A little bit about situational leadership and a couple of models to play with there, and then some approaches that you can take in order to, I guess, get the best results. How it's going to work today is I'm going to be mostly sharing slides, but there'll be a couple of moments where I'll switch cameras and you can just we'll have a bit of a more of a face-to-face period where I can talk to you without the benefit of, or the mask of a slide pack to hide behind. So hopefully that works for everyone. So who's today for? Well, really, in my mind, there's three potential audiences that could come into this webinar. Leaders in business who are seeking some practical tools and some advice. And then secondly, HR professionals who are interested in something simple that they can do or use to help their own people. And then finally, people in organizations who are experiencing some changes as a result of COVID and who are just looking for something a little bit more practical to take forward and maybe some support. So that's who this is for. And my first question, and again, drop this in the chat just so we keep people sort of engaged with the session, is how much do you know about situational leadership? And maybe if you want to use a not a lot to heaps, that's my scale for today, a not a lot to heaps scale. So just drop in the chat whereabouts you think you sit and how much you know about situational leadership. Fantastic. We've got a 15-year-old on the call. That's absolutely superb. How exciting. Awesome. So some good responses coming in there. And in my mind, this is what we put in the pre-blurb that we sent out to potential participants. Why is this topic important? And I'll let you read that for yourself. Now, in my mind, actually, the easy way to say this is this. It's pretty crazy right now, okay? And most people need a sounding board to deal with this COVID situation to know one of two things. Either, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do, or I think I'm doing something, but I'm not sure if it's the right thing to do. And so people like me work in this world to help people manage their teams more effectively, manage themselves more effectively, and get some better results. So that's really what we're here to do today, is to try and simplify and offer some thoughts on how you can do this more effectively, whether you're a leader or whether you're an individual contributor or whether you're an HR professional. So who am I? Why am I even bothering to talk about this? What credibility or pedigree have I got in this space? Well, my role is to help leaders unlock confidence and skills they need to overcome modern leadership challenges. What's my background? As Emma kindly mentioned, I started my career as a British Army officer. My first job out of Sandhurst, which was the British Officer Training Academy, was Gulf War II. So as a young 23-year-old, I was commanding 110 soldiers across Basra province, dealing with resupply all over the place. And so learning to work with teams who weren't necessarily in the same place as me and having some ability to connect with them and communicate and build trust and all those pieces that we're going to talk about later was an absolutely key facet of my career building. Once I left the military, I became a corporate person and worked my way up to be a corporate GM. Two notable moments that stood out in my mind were taking over the recruitment function for Westpac and suddenly being faced with my team moving from 14 people to 6 people, but the expectations didn't change. And so within the first year, we increased productivity as a team by 220%. So why do I say that? Not to brag, but because I've had to deal with those tempestuous changes, those moments and shifts where you have to do something different and think differently. The other one that really springs to mind is when I was a GM working in a university over here in New Zealand, and we suddenly found a legislative change put our entire business model under some pretty significant pressure. Again, that was a moment where we had to step up and deal with that situation. And we're talking, this is about a $40 million a year business at risk. And that year we still managed to break even by making some pretty significant choices and making some strategies and plans to take us forward. So that's why I'm on these calls to the webinar today, to try and share with you some of the ideas that I came up with along the way. No, I should have turned those notifications off. Apologies. So these are some of the companies I've been working with for the last couple of years since I left the corporate world. And I've been partnering with teams and with executives in some of these brands, or in all of these brands, but there's others as well. Really trying to decide how to help them and work with them, partner with them to deliver more effective team results. So there's some household names there, and there's some smaller businesses as well. I think probably my greatest sense of achievement actually comes from Pringle Joinery down on the bottom row there, who we managed to, is a relatively small business in Scotland, and we managed to increase his turnover by £800,000 a year, which for him was nearly doubling his business in 1 year, just by putting into place some of the simple leadership practices that I had come up with. Now, that's not to say that leadership is the only way to come up with, to improve your business. In fact, it isn't the only way to come up with your business whatsoever. That you've got strategy and you've got planning and you've got finance and marketing and sales and all those other things. But the piece I focus on tends to be just the leadership bit. So let's have a quick lay of the land just to kind of bring everybody up to speed and help you think about the same type of stuff I think about. So hopefully most of you have seen something that looks like this before. And the particular bit I want to draw your attention to is the highlighted in blue on the top row, VUCA. So what is VUCA? VUCA is the acronym for the way leadership tends to be operating right now, the environment that leadership tends to be operating in. And VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And underneath that, in the highlighted orange bits at the bottom, you can see all the mindsets and skills that you need to thrive in a VUCA world. And that to me seems quite complicated. There's a lot going on there, but it's the nature of modern business is that it has those 4 characteristics. And let's think about the world of remote work. Back in 2016, Charlier shared this piece of research, which said that teams in the future will be composed of varied configurational dimensions, referring to the extent to which team members in total are dispersed across 2 or more locations. That's him essentially saying people are going to get more and more virtual and more remote as time goes on. What I'm sure he didn't anticipate was COVID. And so all of a sudden we've experienced a transition from the prospect of could I occasionally work from home, the minority working remotely. In fact, it was almost seen as a privilege by many in many businesses, to all of a sudden we've got people working from their couches, people working from their bedrooms, people working from the kitchen table. And that's really thrown a bit of a disrupt into the way we operate and think as leaders. So is it VUCA? Definitely. Or is it even ultra VUCA? And this is a little term I used in a blog I wrote last week or a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about really this is VUCA on steroids. So it's super volatile, super uncertain, super complex, and even more ambiguous than you can think about. And the analogy that I like to use in this leadership context is kind of like being on a whitewater raft going down a river. And if you can picture this, business is essentially this fast flowing river, and you and your team are the people that you can see in the picture there going down a whitewater raft, in the raft, paddling down this river. Now, you can see some various different expressions on people's faces there. Some of them look absolutely terrified, some of them filled with joy, some of them swallowing water. But the reality is, this is the environment we're operating in right now, and it only goes one way. The river doesn't flow backwards, it only flows forwards. So those leaders who think they can rely on what worked previously are going to be mistaken. Now, the other thing to think about in this river is occasionally you come across some rapids. And what we've just experienced in the COVID context is essentially a rapid like no other. It's a once in one century rapid. And the reality is most of these leaders haven't had the opportunity to train for how you lead in an ultra VUCA environment. So they've been left found wanting. Their leadership development programs that they've been going on have not potentially delivered what they needed to in order to prepare people for this situation. Or maybe they haven't had any leadership development at all. Maybe their HR teams haven't budgeted for that, or it's been something that was cut over the years. We've been preparing essentially for quite an economically prevalent environment. The American economy has been better than it's ever been, according to various politicians. China has been booming. And so most businesses weren't anticipating such a situation like this. So what have the organizational responses been to the ultra VUCA whitewater rafting rapid scenario? Well, the model I like to use here is called the PAST approach and tends to be carried out in 4 stages. First one, people have been panicking. Then they think about adapting. Then they start surviving, and then they move to thriving. And you can see as the model gets taller, less and less organizations are able to reach that next layer. And in reality, what we've seen is the vast majority are panicking. Why? Well, in 2020, EY, Ernst & Young, a well-recognized global consulting firm, stated that 79% of board members thought that their organizations were not very well prepared to deal with a crisis event. And then we had the crisis of all crises. And that's caused us some pain. So those businesses have maybe now, post-COVID, after 12 to 16 weeks in lockdown and working from home and things all shifting, maybe they're starting to move up to the adapting phase. Maybe they're even surviving or thriving. And that's fantastic. What we're starting to see, though, are new parameters start to emerge. And I'll share some of those a little bit later. And what about the people within those businesses? Essentially, we're here to talk about leadership today. So how do you lead those people when they're in these crisis moments, when they're in panic, when they're in the adaptive phase, when they're surviving and when they're thriving? And that's really what situational leadership is all about. So this model is really a more granular look at the previous model. So you can see down the left-hand side there, we've got the same 4 phases of the past model: panic, adaptive, survive, and thrive. But if we start down the bottom there, have a think about your team, or maybe think about yourself if you're not a leader of other people. And think about, where do you sit on this ladder model? Are you down in the chaos zone? So are you sabotaging yourself and others because you just don't know what's going on and you're really not coping very well? Are you confused? Are you running to keep up with everything that's going on? Are you not sure of the new norms, the new ways of working, how things are operating, how to survive? Are you maybe more competent? So you're just turning up to work and doing what you always did. in the hope that it'll get back to normal soon. Are you confident? Perhaps you've thought that you know how to deal with this new situation. You're surviving, you're getting by, and you're probably quite effective over the short term, but maybe not strategically. Maybe you're constructive, starting to develop some new ideas and approaches to getting by post-COVID. Maybe you're in a compelling place, so you're delivering some impactful initiatives and ideas. Or finally, perhaps for some of you, and I'm excited to hear if you are, you're in that cutting edge space, shaping the future and innovating. And really this model is just a way of assessing from a situational leadership perspective where you think you sit and where you think your team sit. Now, obviously, we can't lead somebody who is in maybe the compelling or constructive space in the same way we would lead somebody who's in the confused or chaotic space. So that's what we're going to come on to a little bit later. Perhaps pop in the chat right now where you think you sit on that model. Now, I talked about those new COVID factors that were starting to emerge. And this is really now as we start to see people getting used to working from home, and what's happening as companies and organizations gradually shift back from everybody working at home to some people working at home. And we're starting to create what we call these blended teams. Those blended teams are made up of some people working from home and some people working in the office. And that in itself is quite disruptive. But think about this. A lot of people who've been forced to work from home and they hadn't potentially considered this before, but they've quite enjoyed that autonomy. They've quite enjoyed being away from the manager, away from the prying eyes from Big Brother, and just getting on with the work. And I saw a really interesting piece of research about 3-4 weeks ago, which said that on average, the remote worker was 13% more productive than a non-remote worker because they had a lack of distractions. Now, in New Zealand, there was a contrary piece of research which said that people who worked from home were actually 1% less productive. And they think that that was because people were struggling with the adaptation to remote work. But I think we'll see that get back to a net positive in terms of productivity. Interestingly also, people who worked from home on their own were seen to be less productive, and people who worked from home with children were seen to be less productive, again, because they had to adapt, they had to work out how to make it all work. So a lot of the leaders I've been coaching, we've actually been putting into place psychological contracts with manager, family, and self, because that allows them to manage that autonomy a little bit more effectively. Now, the problem with having teams, some of them in the office and some of them at home, is we get to a situation of what we call isolatory discrimination. Isolated discrimination is those people who aren't here aren't as effective, aren't as important, and aren't as involved as those who are in the office with the small team. And that isolated discrimination could cause some real issues. So for example, if you've got a really high performer, but at the moment they've got childcare responsibilities, or maybe they've got an immunocompromised partner or child, and they can't leave home for a good reason, then they might feel a little bit discriminated against if they're not involved. So situational leadership applies again. How do you engage with these people? There may be people who are unable to come to work also, who are getting real FOMO. They're starting to see the office banter picking up again. They're starting to see people really hit their stride back in the office. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, maybe I should be in the office, but I can't. And that creates FOMO, fear of missing out. What I've seen start to happen as well is small, fast teams emerging. So, 3 people are in the office. Let's get together in a meeting room and plan out how we're going to do this post-COVID stuff. Well, that's great, but are they the right people to be in that team? Or are there valuable resources that are being left out because they're not there? And then there's a piece of thought which goes to what got us here isn't going to get us there. And we talked about the new world post-COVID rapids on our whitewater rafting trip. And the way we paddled before, the way we navigated the river has changed. We've all gone through an experience together. And that's going to potentially change how we need to approach the future in a post-COVID economic situation. I was having a fantastic conversation about a week ago with a country manager up in Korea. who said, we're a B2B business, a B2B service business. And quite frankly, I think our business is going to fundamentally shift because we are no longer going to be going into office blocks, putting in large scale installations because most of our clients are now dispersed and working from home. That disrupts our entire product and service portfolio. So what got us to this point as a successful business isn't going to get us to where we want to go. So how do leaders deal with this new world? And I'm just going to shift to a different cam. The reality is the new world is different, but it's based on some really core principles. And I wanted to share a little bit of a story about when I was in the military. And I say I was 23 years old. I landed in southern Iraq in the middle of Gulf War II, and basically was told to take over logistic resupply for Basra, working in a headquarters with a group of soldiers at my disposal, doing little logistic resupply runs. And they were based all over the province. And I remember my platoon sergeant saying to me at the time, Jimmy, you need to get the guys' trust. And once they trust you, it doesn't matter if your plan's wrong. It doesn't matter if your strategy's flawed. They'll make it work. And 9 times out of 10, they will deliver. And so a lot of the leadership stuff I've done over the last couple of years has really been focusing on leadership based on trust. And that's the starting point of all my situational leadership models. It also is the best way to get somebody from the bottom of the ladder to get them from chaos to the next layer up. So let's have a look at that and how that works. You're the captain of your whitewater raft. Now that might be that you've never served in the military. It might be that you've never even been in a whitewater raft, but hopefully it's easier to imagine yourself paddling a whitewater raft down a river with a team of people than it is to think about running around southern Iraq, and probably less traumatic, I hope. But the reality is you're the person that steers the boat. You're the person that plots the course. You're the person that encourages everybody. You sit at the back and you watch people. You're looking out for hazards. And so you, as the captain of your whitewater raft, have a great role to play in leading the rest of the crew. And they're going to be looking to you for advice. I wanted to just take a pause and talk about the power of reflection. And the reason I wanted to talk about reflection in particular was because we think about all these things we've just mentioned up to date. There's planning, strategy, marketing, sales, finance, and we've honed in on the concept of leadership. And now we're going to just tunnel a little bit more focused onto the power of reflection, because I believe reflection is one of the single biggest levers you can pull as a leader. There's a piece of research here from, I think it's Harvard Business Review, and the link is below if anybody wants to grab it, that after a period of reflection, and the optimal average is about 15 minutes reflection per day, and then sharing that reflection with somebody else has a 25% improvement in productivity. Now that's a pretty significant stat to pull out, and I have done a bit more digging into it, and it was actually done with a company in Bangalore. They ran this experiment, and they noticed that there was a 23% improvement in people who just reflected, and then a 25% in people who reflected and shared. So what I did when I was helping leaders through the COVID period was help them engender reflection into their team. And I came up with this very simple tool. And as I say, most of the things I create with teams are very simple, almost obvious, but there's a difference between knowing and doing. So what I try and get the leaders to do is the doing stuff. And so this worksheet, which again, the link is below, and I'll share this slide pack after the webinar for anybody who wants it, or I'll pop in the chat after when we're doing questions. Created this very simple worksheet, and it just asks a series of questions to ask you to first reflect on your own situation. And then what I suggested was leaders share their responses with their teams and ask their teams to fill in the same reflection document and share back to one another or as a group or to their leader. Now that power of engendering a habit of reflection is super powerful. And so this is just one tool that we created which allowed the power of reflection to be utilized in a post-COVID environment. Now, the beauty of this is this gives you a little bit of a temperature check on that ladder. Then let's think about situational leadership. And what tends to happen with situational leadership is we have lots of complex models that look like this. This is one that was developed by Hersey and Blanchard in the 1960s in the US. And basically, the simple way of reading it is you work out where somebody is on their developmental scale using the scale at the bottom, and then you use that to help decide how you're going to lead them. But it's a little bit complicated to get your head around. And there's curves and different sections and quadrants, and I've found it's not super useful for your average manager to get their head around. And what even is situational leadership? Well, in my world, situational leadership is leaders leading people in the way they need to be led. And so it could be that if somebody's down in that chaos space, that they need to be led in a different way to somebody who is really thriving and or maybe even compelling, maybe even cutting edge. They're going to need a different style of leadership. That's situational leadership. So this model's good, but it does have some limitations. It's complicated to understand and read. It was a US-based model. And as we know from US culture, it's different to other cultures. And it doesn't really consider the priorities or communication styles of other cultures. So it's built for American leaders. It also happens to ignore the differences between male and female leaders. And it's quite a transactional, tactical level model. So it tends to divert attention away from long-term strategies and policies. And those limitations were picked up from an STU study, which I've linked to and just underneath. So then let's have a look at another situational leadership model. This is one which is essentially a simplification of Hersey Blanchard, and it pops people into one of 4 boxes. Enthusiastic beginners, disillusioned learners, capable but cautious, and self-reliant achievers. And I've just worked anti-clockwise around that model. Now, the reality is here again, are people just one of 4 pigeonholes? Are all people who are in the orange box disillusioned learners? Potentially not. So perhaps it's an oversimplification of situational leadership. So we come back to my leadership model, and it's a leadership ladder essentially. And we've talked through the basis of the model, but you can see it offers more options. It also offers some typical activity seen. So we start to think about what are we seeing, what are we observing in the different types of people. And I apologize for the pop-ups. I have put it on Do Not Disturb, but they're still coming in. So apologies for that. So let's think about the core elements of leadership. And I mentioned when I was an army officer that trust was the most important facet of leadership in my world. And this is the leadership model I use when I go and talk to businesses. And I start at trust at the top, and I work around clockwise through emotional intelligence, emotional quotient, EQ, communication, growth mindset, problem solving, and agility. And what I encourage leaders to do is first build those capabilities within themselves, and then create an environment to grow those capabilities with their teams. And you'll see that there's a little star in the middle. What I try and do is to create 6-star leadership. That's better than 5-star hotels. That's 6-star leadership, which is the absolute zenith of leadership capability. Now, if we get those things right, we start to create an environment or a bubble of future leadership. So if we get trust, EQ, and communication right, we create an environment of psychological safety. If we get communication, growth mindset, and problem solving right, we create an environment of change resilience. And if we get problem solving, agility, and trust right, we get an environment of innovation. And what we do when we work with leaders is assess where they're at on that leadership ladder, and then make a response to take them forward using this model as the basis of where we go. So the challenge is then, how do we map the gray bubble to the ladder, and then what do we do with it? So here's an example, and this is by no means exhaustive, and we're sitting at a pretty high level here, but this is an example of the type of things you could do if you were working with a leader who was if you were working with somebody as a leader in various levels. So thinking about joining the gray bubble to the ladder again, somebody who's in chaos, remember that they are potentially sabotaging themselves or others. What we want to do is try and work with them to create an environment of psychological safety. That means building trust, showing EQ, and helping them develop their EQ so they don't damage themselves or others. And ideally, if we think about that whitewater rafting analogy, we want to rescue them. We want to reassure them. These are the people that have fallen out the boat. These are the people that are floating downstream, potentially drowning. Worst case scenario is that we might need to remove them. And I say that is a worst case scenario. We do want to try and rescue and reassure before we remove people from our organization. However, if they're unable to be reassured and we can't bring them back in line and they're still sabotaging our business, we have to make that difficult call. Let's jump up to confident. So what we've done is we've worked a little bit further around the model, and we're in that creating an environment of change resilience. So for confident people, we want to keep them growing. They're confident in what they're doing, but they can grow to more. They can even grow to constructive. So we're going to create an environment of change resilience through challenging their growth mindset. This means helping them think in bigger ways, maybe seeing more moving parts, maybe seeing how the pieces of the puzzle fit together outside their little function. We're also going to get them to do some problem solving. So taking more of a coaching mindset. Instead of giving them the answers, maybe get them to try and work it out for themselves. And helping them to really understand why they're doing things. So in the lower layers, we want to show them what to do and how to do it and get them to be good at doing it. Once you know once you know why you're doing something, it allows you to have a bit more of an intent play than just the transaction itself. So when we did this with soldiers, when I was briefing soldiers in the military, one of the things that I would do was I would always say, my intent is this. So even if I wasn't able to be face to face with the soldier when they faced a difficult situation, they knew what my intent was. Let's use a wartime analogy. When the Allies were going into Europe, the intent was to take Berlin. So even if the route from the shores of France across Europe was a little bit higgledy-piggledy, and maybe there were some diversions and some other things happened, all the soldiers in the Allied force knew that the intent was to get to Berlin. When I was in Afghanistan, the intent was always to protect the VIP. When I was in Iraq, the intent was always to make sure that the fighting soldiers on the ground had the supplies they needed. So the why people are doing things is way more important than the how and the what to do once they're tactically aware of the drills and skills, as we call them in the military, but essentially the transactional process that they're involved in. So I've unpacked a couple of pieces of the model there, and I'm just going to give you 30 seconds just to read through the other pieces while I grab a drink. Okay, so what's the payoff from doing this situational leadership stuff? Well, the bit of research that I've been looking at is the impact level in terms of the differentiators between somebody who is confused to somebody who's cutting edge. There's a variety of papers that sit behind this model, but essentially what we know is somebody who's competent in what they're doing is twice as productive and has twice the impact of somebody who's confused. Somebody who's cutting edge has 10 times the impact of somebody who's confused. So really, if we can just move each person in our team one level up this ladder by applying some of the situational leadership tools that I've talked about here and using the model that I've got, then we can see a significant, almost an exponential increase in performance and impact. And we add that to the power of reflection, 25% increase in productivity. Can you imagine the type of situation you could create with your team? To me, that's compelling. So we've kind of reached a hiatus point from my perspective. But what I wanted to say is I've given you a bit of an insight into the basics of situational leadership, power of reflection, talked a little bit about the current environment and some new challenges that are emerging. If you'd like to learn how to do some of this stuff a little bit more, or even you just want to know some more, then you can connect with me in a few ways. I do run programs for business leaders and also one for HR professionals to help them upskill. So I'd be happy to talk more about that offline. I also run leadership workshops in-house, so both facilitating strategy and design and development, and also working with leaders in their leadership capability. You can follow my blog, or you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'd be happy to connect with anybody who wants to have a conversation. And Emma, that is everything from me.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I absolutely loved listening to that, and I know our attendees did as well. Rosemary wrote in there, I really like how your leadership model looks at both the capabilities and the impact on psych, safety, change, resilience, and innovation. So guys, if you have any questions, please pop them in either the chat or the Q&A, and I've got one here to start us off. So obviously, when we're planning in the future for, let's just call it a crisis, right? I mean, none of us planned for this particular crisis.
No.
And
How do you plan?
That's right. But there are going to be things that come up in the future now, whether it's similar or completely different to this. And how do we, as an organization, I guess, at least look at it or plan the way we can for it?
Yeah, great question. And if I go back to my military days again, one of the things we would do was, well, there's two things we would do actually. We would do, first of all, in the briefing process, we'd call it actions on. So what happens if somebody gets lost? What happens if somebody gets shot? What happens if the enemy isn't where we thought they were going to be? And then we would essentially war game, hypothesize through that scenario. And that would allow us to all be on the same page when something did happen, we could deal with it. And so from my perspective, the wargaming mentality is equally applicable in business. And when I was running the international education department at the university, one of the things we did was we would wargame markets collapsing, and then we would work out what we were going to do. And then all of a sudden, the immigration change actually was pretty similar to a market collapsing. We couldn't take students from certain countries, and that allowed us to have a response plan in play. The other thing we did was being really clear on intent and doing the rehearsals prior to going into any engagement. So I think, if I was to do a show of hands around the leaders I work with, most of them think BCP is that dusty document you get out once a year, maybe blow the dust off and the flies off it and just have a flick through and go, yep, we've got that. BCP is critical in order to lead an organization through crisis. And now we have the ultimate crisis to plan against. We can start thinking about what were the challenges to our business, our people, our products, our services, our finances. And when that happened in the COVID environment, what was the consequence and what did we have to do as a result? Therefore, we can extrapolate forward. Hopefully, nothing is ever going to be as bad as COVID again, but we've got our measured response plan. If I think about the country manager I was talking to last week, we actually worked up 4 different scenarios depending on whether his B2B business was going to become a B2C business or varying different versions of that. And the reality was that he said, in order to be adaptable, and it was a great quote actually, in order to be adaptable, we've got to be super planned in order to deal with the next 1 in 100 year pandemic.
For sure. I was thinking about the other day, even though, hopefully we may not get a pandemic similar to this in the near future, even just having a plan for all your team having to work from home, like there's going to be other reasons in the future why that happens that might be nothing to do with COVID. And I think a lot of people were caught out, and rightly so, with how does my entire team, how does all of ANZ headquarters work at home?
Completely. And for business lead, if I'm thinking executives here, but also middle managers, the same thing applies. Shifting that frame of reference from I have to I get to. So let's use that I have to make a plan for my team to work from home. I get to have my team working in a place that they feel really comfortable. I have to shut down the office. I get to free up resources from not having to pay a lease on fixed assets. So there's lots of opportunity in the reframing here in order to help people design their future planning when they think about I get to, and it creates a more creative space.
Yeah, so we've got a question from Andrew. He said, time frame with situational leadership interests me. How might the model change between acute and chronic situations? I'm thinking of Captain Sully, who landed the plane on the Hudson River, and his acute situational leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great question, Andrew. The way I think about situational leadership is, I think I mentioned it in the conversation, is leading people how they need to be led in that moment, at that time, with a view on the bigger picture. And that was one of the disadvantages of the Hersey Blanchard model, is it tends to be quite situational, a tactical situational, not strategic situational. So if we use that example of Sully, obviously he had to deal with an immediate scenario, which is almost a knee-jerk almost an automatic response, that rehearsed response of what to do, have a peace of mind in order to be able to lead to land his plane and then lead the crew through the process, and then obviously be part of a wider investigation. As time goes on with situational leadership in the model I have, what you're doing is you're temperature checking people where they're at on the ladder in various scenarios. And I'm going to say, I think I mentioned it quite early on in the slides, people could have potentially moved from that panic to the adaptive or maybe even the thriving stage. But because now we've changed the game again, we're starting to have people come back to work. We're starting to have people who are in blended teams. The situation they find themselves in may disrupt them back to panic. It may disrupt them back to adaptive. So maybe they were thriving and surviving. Maybe they're now lower on the ladder. Therefore, the situational leadership tier that they're at is lower. Therefore, the situational leadership response is different.
Yeah. Andrew also said he couldn't have landed that plane if he was in panic mode, which is very true.
No, panic, and that's the thing. Generally, when I was go back to that Korean country manager again, adaptability comes from planning, rehearsal, wargaming. And then when you've run it a few times, then you can adapt, and you can respond more effectively to that scenario because you're almost in muscle memory.
Great. Rosemary had a question. She said, clarity of intent is akin to clarity of purpose. Do you think organizations are clear on their purpose at the moment and the culture will get them to the next point?
Thanks, Rosemary. That's a good question. Variable would be my answer in this circumstance. There are some amazing organizations out there who have got sensational clarity of purpose amongst their executive team, and they've done a fantastic job of cascading that through the organization. Are they the majority? Probably not. Often when I go into leadership teams and do work with them, I'll say, what's your vision, values, purpose? And they'll say, oh, it's on those posters over there. And then you walk to the warehouse or the manufacturing line or the shop floor, and you say, what's your vision, values, and purpose? And they're like, oh, I have no idea. Or yeah, I think there was a poster about that somewhere, but they're not understood. And even if they're understood, they're not necessarily embraced by the people in the organization. So how is their culture then going to carry them through these challenging times when they don't even understand the reality of vision, values, purpose, clarity?
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy. And Katura, I hope I said that right. I'm not sure if I said that name right. Said it'd be great to see this model offered to senior school teachers. It would give them a great base to guide the kids to grow.
Fantastic. Well, Katura, I would love to have a conversation with any senior school teachers. And I know I'm thinking through the back of my mind. I think Andrew is also an education expert. That's his playing field. So Andrew, perhaps a collaboration between the two of us could be a cool idea.
Love it. Well, look, I'm going to leave it there and I'm going to wrap up. But Jimmy, thank you so much for giving us your time and knowledge today. We have recorded this session and it will be available later today on the Learning Hub for our members. And if you're not a member yet, but you would like to know more, head over to the Future of Leadership website for more information on all the member benefits and how to be part of our program. On the 23rd of June, we are hosting a free webinar, which we'd love you all to join us for. Katrina Webb is going to be giving her keynote on accountability in the age of self-leadership. And of course, if you guys didn't know already, Hands Across the Water are doing their virtual ride challenge at the moment. Now we are, 9 days into June and they're riding 800 kilometers through the month of June for the kids from home or around their neighborhood. If you still want to join, you might have a little bit of catching up to do, but it's definitely possible. So you can visit the ridetoprovide.com.au website, or if you know anyone riding, we would ask that you would donate to them if possible, because obviously all the money we raise is going to our kids while we are going through this COVID-19 situation and we can't get to Thailand. But look, thank you so much for joining us again today, and Jimmy, for your time. Hopefully we'll see you all in a few weeks, but until then, stay safe and be kind to those around you. Thanks, Jimmy.
Take care. Thanks, guys.